Number 1. Tamara Samsanova. On a summer night, in one of those typical apartment blocks in St. Petersburg, security cameras captured an elderly woman going in and out of an apartment building, each time carrying a couple of heavy plastic bags. She made the trip 7 times, calm and steady, like she was just taking out the trash. Those bags weren't full of ordinary trash. When police opened them, they found pieces of a human body. And the woman on the footage was Tamara Samsanova, a 68-year-old grandmother who lived right there on the 4th floor. That same night, they traced the bags back to her building and knocked on her door. Inside, they found bloodstains, a bloodied knife, and the torn shower curtain from the bathroom. She admitted straight away that she had killed her neighbor, 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova. Valentina had been staying with Tamara while some work was being done on her own flat. They knew each other well enough. According to Tamara, they had a small argument about some unwashed cups. That evening, she made Valentina an Olivier salad, the classic Russian one, and crushed around 50 sleeping pills into it. Once Valentina passed out, Tamara spent the rest of the night cutting the body apart in the bathroom with 2 knives and a hacksaw. She bagged up the pieces and started carrying them out one by one. The head and hands were never found. But this wasn't some one-off crime. The more police dug, the clearer it became that Tamara had been doing this for years. She had lived in that same panel apartment on Dimitrov Street in the Frunzensky district since the early 1970s. She worked for 16 years at the Grand Hotel, Europe, and the Intourist travel agency before she retired. After her husband Alexei disappeared around the year 2000, she started renting out rooms to help pay the bills. Most of the tenants came and went without any trouble. A few of them didn't. Back in September of 2003, one of those tenants, 44-year-old Sergei Potyavin from Norilsk, got into an argument with her. Sergei ended up dead. Tamara dismembered his body in the flat and scattered the pieces around the streets in her district. Police later tied the case to her through a business card they found and through notes she had written. And those notes, that's what really stayed with the investigators. In her apartment, they discovered a handwritten diary. The pages were full of ordinary stuff, like complaints about sleeping badly, notes about drinking coffee, mixed in with detailed accounts of what she had done. One entry talked about killing a tenant she called Volodya, cutting him up in the bathroom, and dumping the bags in different parts of the Frunzensky district. She described doing the same thing to others, too. A neighbor later remembered that Tamara had been fascinated with the old Soviet cannibal killer, Andrei Chikatilo. She used to collect whatever information she could about his crimes. Police started looking into whether Tamara could be responsible for as many as 11 or 14 deaths over 15 years or more. They never found enough solid evidence to charge her with all of them. Most of the bodies were never recovered, but the pattern was there. Tamara herself had been in psychiatric hospitals 3 times before any of this came to light. When doctors examined her after the arrest, they diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. They said she was a danger to herself and to everyone around her. Because of that, she never stood a full criminal trial. Instead, the court sent her to a high-security psychiatric hospital in Kazan for compulsory treatment. Some reports say the order was for 10 years. Others describe it as indefinite. Either way, she has been there ever since, under lock and key. The 2 murders they could prove, Valentina Ulanova and Sergei Potyavin, were enough to keep her confined for the rest of her life. Police looked hard at the diary and the other missing people, but without more remains or direct links, the rest stayed as suspicions. They also wondered whether she had eaten parts of any of the victims, but they never found proof either way. Number 2. Leonarda Cianciulli. In the small town of Correggio, up in northern Italy, Leonarda Cianciulli ran a little shop that locals liked to visit. She was the kind of woman who always had time to chat or offer a bit of advice if you needed it. People trusted her, but behind that friendly face was a mother carrying a heavy load of fear. Leonarda had been through a lot before she ever settled in Correggio. She was born in a southern village called Montella back in 1894. She married young, had 17 pregnancies in all, lost 3 babies to miscarriage, and another 10 who died while they were still little. Only 4 children made it to adulthood. That kind of loss leaves a mark. And 2 warnings from the past haunted her more than anything. A fortune teller had once told her that every one of her children would die young. Then a woman who read palms said Leonarda herself would end up behind bars and in a criminal asylum. By the late 1930s, her eldest son Giuseppe was getting ready to join the Italian army as World War II drew closer. Leonarda became convinced the only way to keep him safe was to make human sacrifices. She believed that was the only thing strong enough to break the curse. She started with a neighbor named Faustina Setti. Faustina was 73, had never married, and came to Leonarda asking for help finding a husband. Leonarda invited her over, promised she could arrange something, and offered her a glass of wine. The wine was laced with drugs. Once Faustina was unconscious, Leonarda killed her with an axe. She cut the body into pieces, boiled most of it down with 7 kilos of caustic soda until it dissolved into a thick mush, and poured it away. She collected the blood, dried it, ground it up, and mixed it with flour, sugar, chocolate, milk, eggs, and a little margarine to bake into tea cakes. She served those cakes to guests who stopped by and ate some herself, along with Giuseppe. She even turned the rest of the remains into bars of soap and gave them away to neighbors. Before it was over, she took Faustina's life savings, 30,000 lire. About a year later, in September of 1940, she did it again. This time, the victim was Francesca Soavi, a middle-aged woman who used to teach kindergarten and was looking for a new job. Leonarda told her about an opening at a school in Piacenza. Francesca came over, had the same spiked wine, and met the same end with the axe. Leonarda went through the exact same process with the body, made more soap and more tea cakes, and took 3,000 lire from her. Just a few weeks after that, on the 30th of September, it was Virginia Cacioppo's turn. Virginia was 53, a widow who had once been a soprano singer at La Scala Opera House in Milan. She wanted secretarial work, so Leonarda offered her a position in Florence. Same invitation, same drugged wine, same axe. This time, Leonarda added a bit of cologne to the soap mixture to make it smell nicer. She took 50,000 lire from Virginia, plus some jewels and bonds. But Virginia had family who noticed right away when she vanished. Her sister-in-law, Albertina Fanti, had actually seen her walk into Leonarda's home. When Virginia never came back or sent any word, Albertina went straight to the police. The police started asking questions around town. They came to Leonarda's place. At first, she denied everything, but the moment they hinted that her son Giuseppe could be pulled into the investigation as a possible accomplice, she changed her mind and told them the whole story in detail. She even explained how she had written fake letters and postcards from the victims to their relatives, so it would look like they had simply moved away for new lives. The war delayed the trial, but in 1946, Leonarda stood in court in Reggio Emilia. She showed no regret at all. In fact, she corrected the prosecutor on a few details from the witness stand and even boasted that she had donated the copper ladle she used to skim the fat to the war effort because the country needed metal. The court found her guilty of the 3 murders, destroying the bodies, and theft. They sentenced her to 30 years in prison, plus 3 years in a criminal asylum. She served her time and eventually ended up in the women's criminal asylum in Pozzuoli, near Naples. That's where she died in 1970 at the age of 76. Number 3. Juana Barraza. In a crowded working-class neighborhood of Mexico City, one January afternoon in 2006, a tenant glanced out his window and saw an older woman leaving the apartment of his 82-year-old neighbor, Ana Maria Reyes. Something felt off. He followed her down the street, caught up with her, and waved down the first police car he spotted. When the officers searched the woman, they found a stethoscope in her bag, along with blank pension forms and a fake government ID card that said she was a social worker. That woman was Juana Barraza. She was 48 years old, built strong and broad-shouldered, and she had just strangled Ana Maria in her own living room. What the police did not know yet was that they had finally caught the person the whole city had been calling El Mataviejitas, the little old lady killer, and they were in for a bigger surprise. Juana Barraza was a professional luchadora, a wrestler who stepped into the ring night after night under the name La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. While police were hunting for this killer, she was still performing in amateur matches around Mexico City and even sat for a television interview talking about her latest bouts just 1 week before her arrest. Her story starts long before that afternoon. Juana was born in 1957 in a small rural town called Epazoyucan, about 2 hours north of Mexico City. Life there was hard. When she was only 12 or 13, her alcoholic mother handed her over to an older man in exchange for 3 bottles of beer. That man kept her captive and abused her for years. She had a son during that time. Later, she had 3 more children and raised them mostly on her own. She sold popcorn at wrestling events to get by, and somewhere along the way, she started training and wrestling herself as a ruda, the tough heel who the crowd loves to boo. But something darker was growing inside her. Juana carried a deep anger toward elderly women. She told investigators later that every time she looked at one, she saw her own mother, the woman who had betrayed her and cursed her life. That anger finally spilled over in the late 1990s. She began approaching women in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who lived alone. She would offer to carry their shopping bags or tell them she was a government nurse, there to help with pension papers or a free health check. Once she was inside their apartments, she would chat for a minute or two, then strangle them, sometimes with the stethoscope she carried, sometimes with a phone cord or a pair of tights. She took whatever cash and jewelry she could find and left. The killings continued for years. Police knew they had a serial murderer on their hands, but the description from witnesses threw them completely. People talked about a masculine-looking figure, strong and stocky, so the authorities put out sketches of a man, even suggesting it might be a male transvestite. No one seriously considered that the killer could be a woman. Meanwhile, Juana kept her double life going. She wrestled in local rings, trained others, and went about her days like any other working mother. She is believed to have killed between 40 and 48 elderly women in total, though the evidence only held up solid in 16 cases. The rest stayed as strong suspicions. Everything changed on that January day in 2006. The tenant's quick thinking got her arrested on the spot. Fingerprint evidence tied her directly to many of the crime scenes. At trial in 2008, she admitted only to the very last murder, the one involving Ana Maria. She looked the judge in the eye and said, "I only killed one little old lady, not the others." The court did not believe her. On the 31st of March 2008, she was found guilty on 16 murders and the related burglaries. The judge handed down a sentence of 759 years in prison. In Mexico, the law says no one can actually serve more than 60 years, but at her age, that still meant she would likely die behind bars. She was sent to Santa Marta Acatitla prison in Mexico City, where she still is today. She works as a gym instructor for the other inmates, and sometimes sells tacos she makes herself. The woman who once terrified an entire city by preying on its most vulnerable residents now spends her days in the one place where no elderly woman will ever be alone with her again. Number 4. Nanny Doss. Back in the fall of 1954, in a little house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a guy named Samuel Doss sat down to eat some prune cake his wife had baked for him. A few days later, he was dead. The doctor who looked at the body thought something felt off, so they ran some tests. Turns out the cake was loaded with enough arsenic to kill several people. That one suspicious death is how they finally caught Nanny Doss. Nanny was born Nancy Agnes Hazel on November 4th, 1905, in a tiny place called Blue Mountain, Alabama. Her family was poor. Her dad worked the railroad and the farm, and life was rough. She later talked about getting knocked around on a train when she was 7, which left her with bad headaches and blackouts she blamed for a lot of her troubles. She also said her father was abusive and dismissed it when she told him about being raped as a teenager. She didn't get much schooling because she had to work the fields, but she loved flipping through romance magazines and dreaming about the perfect husband. At 16, she married her first husband, Charlie Braggs. They met at the linen thread factory where they both worked, had 4 daughters, and tried to make a go of it in rural Alabama. Things fell apart fast. In 1927, 2 of their little girls, around 4 and 5 years old, died just days apart after eating breakfast. The official word at the time was food poisoning. Charlie eventually took off with their oldest daughter and left Nanny with the youngest one. They divorced in 1928. She didn't stay single for long. Around 1929, she married Robert Franklin Harrelson through one of those Lonely Hearts ads she was always answering. They bounced around between Alabama and North Carolina. Fast forward to 1945. Nanny was babysitting her own grandson, little Robert Lee Haynes, who was just 2 years old. He died while he was in her care, officially listed as asphyxia from unknown causes. She collected a $500 life insurance payout. That same year, on September 15th, her husband Robert came home drunk after a night out with friends. The next day, he drank from one of his hidden jars of moonshine. Nanny later admitted she'd laced it with rat poison. He died that day, and everyone assumed it was just another case of bad food or drink. By the late 40s, she was back on the Lonely Hearts circuit. She met and married Arlie Jackson Lanning and settled in Lexington, North Carolina. While they were together, Arlie's mother, Nanny's mother-in-law, passed away. Then, around 1950, Arlie himself died. The doctors called it heart failure. Nanny collected whatever insurance there was and moved on again. Next came husband number 4, Richard Lewis Morton. They married in 1952 and landed in Emporia, Kansas. Not long after, Nanny's sister Dovie, who'd been bedridden, died right after Nanny came to stay with her for a bit. Then, in January of 1953, Nanny's own mother, Louisa, moved in with them. She got terrible stomach pains and died. A few months later, in May, Richard Morton died as well, after drinking coffee laced with arsenic, though nobody realized it at the time. By June of 1953, Nanny had already found husband number 5 through another Lonely Hearts ad. His name was Samuel Luther Doss, and they got married and set up house in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Samuel got sick in September of 1954 with flu-like symptoms after eating something she'd made. He actually recovered enough to come home from the hospital on October 5th, but on October 12th, he suddenly collapsed and died at home. This time, the doctor insisted on an autopsy. The results showed lethal levels of arsenic, enough to kill more than one person. Police arrested Nanny the same day. When they sat her down for questioning, she stayed calm, almost cheerful. They let her keep her romance magazines in the room, and she started talking. She admitted to poisoning Samuel. Then she kept going. She confessed to killing her 4 husbands in total: Harrelson with the moonshine, Lanning, Morton, and now Samuel. She also owned up to poisoning her mother Louisa, her sister Dovie, her grandson little Robert, and even Arlie Lanning's mother. She'd mixed arsenic or straight rat poison into their coffee, their stewed prunes, their meals, whatever they were eating or drinking. Every time the deaths got written off as natural causes or food poisoning, and she'd collect whatever small insurance money was available and start fresh with a new ad in the paper. On May 17, 1955, inside a Tulsa County courtroom, Nanny Doss pleaded guilty to the murder of Samuel Doss. The case was overseen by Judge Elmer Adams, with Howard Edmondson serving as prosecutor. Despite the number of deaths tied to her, the state did not pursue the death penalty because she was a woman. She got life in prison at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. Throughout the interrogation, she kept smiling and giggling, even as she described exactly how she'd done it. She'd laugh and say things like, "He sure did love those stewed prunes," when they asked about one of the husbands. She told the psychiatrists she was just looking for the real romance she'd read about in all those magazines, the perfect husband who wouldn't drink or cheat or hold her back. She said the headaches and the unhappy marriages pushed her to it, but the doctors still declared her sane. She spent the rest of her life behind bars. 10 years in, on June 2nd, 1965, Nanny Doss died of leukemia in the prison hospital ward. She was 59. Number 5, Dorothea Puente. In November of 1988, police in Sacramento showed up at a plain-looking boarding house on F Street with a search warrant. Neighbors had been complaining that tenants kept disappearing, and a social worker who checked on one of the older guys couldn't find him anywhere. So the officers started digging in the backyard. What they discovered made it clear this wasn't just a missing persons case. They found 7 bodies wrapped in sheets and plastic, buried in shallow holes right there under the rose bushes and the concrete patio. The woman who owned the place, Dorothea Puente, was already gone. To understand how a landlady ended up with a yard full of her own tenants, you have to go back to where it all started. Dorothea Helen Gray was born on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California. Both of her parents struggled with alcohol, and things started falling apart early. Her dad died of tuberculosis when she was 8. Her mom was killed in a motorcycle crash the next year, and Dorothea got sent to an orphanage where she later said she was abused. She bounced around, got married at 16, and that was just the first of 4 marriages that all ended badly. By the time she was in her 20s, she was already in trouble with the law. In 1948, she got arrested for forgery in Riverside and spent 4 months in jail. Not long after she got out, she married a guy named Axel Bren Johansson and settled in Sacramento. In 1960, she was running a bookkeeping office that turned out to be a front for a brothel. She did 90 days for that. A year later, doctors at DeWitt State Hospital diagnosed her as a pathological liar with an unstable personality after a short stay there. She married again in the late 60s, this time to Roberto Jose Puente. That marriage was violent, and she eventually filed a restraining order. By 1978, she was back in court for illegally cashing 34 government checks that belonged to people who had stayed with her. She got 5 years probation and had to pay back $4,000. Even with that record, she opened a boarding house at 1426 F Street in Sacramento. She took in elderly people, disabled folks, and people who were homeless or struggling with mental health. A lot of them lived on Social Security or disability checks, and Dorothea handled the paperwork for them. She made sure they got their mail, she cooked their meals, and she presented herself as this caring, church-going woman who even hosted Alcoholics Anonymous meetings at the house. In 1982, she was convicted of giving drugs to a 74-year-old tenant named Malcolm McKenzie so she could rob him. She served about 3 years in prison. While she was locked up, she started writing letters to a 77-year-old man named Everson Theodore Gilmouth. When she got out, he moved into the boarding house. Around the same time, one of her tenants, a 61-year-old woman named Ruth Monroe, died after taking a big overdose of codeine. At first, the death was listed as undetermined. Dorothea kept running the house. Gilmouth disappeared in late 1985. His body was later found stuffed inside a wooden box dumped along the Sacramento River. Over the next 3 years, more tenants vanished one by one. There was 78-year-old Betty Mae Palmer, 78-year-old Leona Carpenter, 62-year-old James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, who was in her early 60s, Dorothy Miller, who was around 64 or 65, 51-year-old Alvaro Montoya, and 55-year-old Benjamin Fink. Each time someone stopped showing up, Dorothea told people they had moved away or gone to stay with family. Meanwhile, she kept cashing their benefit checks. Prosecutors later figured she collected more than $87,000 in total, and she spent some of that money on things like a facelift. By November of 1988, the missing persons reports had piled up enough that police got that search warrant. When they started turning up bodies in the yard, Dorothea had already taken a bus to Los Angeles. She got arrested there a couple of days later after someone in her hotel recognized her from the news and called the tip line. She was charged with 9 counts of murder. The case was big enough that they moved the trial to Monterey County so it wouldn't be influenced by all the local coverage in Sacramento. It started in February of 1993 and ran for 8 months. There were more than 150 witnesses and over 3,000 exhibits. The prosecution said she had drugged her tenants with prescription pills until they overdosed, then wrapped them up and buried them right there on the property so she could keep collecting their money. The defense argued that some of the people had died of natural causes or had taken too many of their own medications. On August 26, 1993, the jury convicted her on 3 counts: first-degree murder for Dorothy Miller and Benjamin Fink, and second-degree murder for Leona Carpenter. They also found the multiple murder special circumstance to be true. They deadlocked on the other 6 deaths, so those charges were dismissed. In December, the judge sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole. She was sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. While she was serving that sentence, Dorothea did something pretty unusual. In 2004, she co-wrote and published a cookbook called Cooking with a Serial Killer. It had recipes she said she used to make for her tenants back at the boarding house. She stayed in prison for the rest of her life. On March 27, 2011, she died at age 82 from natural causes in the prison hospital ward. Number 6. Fay Copeland. In the fall of 1989, police pulled up to a quiet 40-acre farm outside the tiny town of Mooresville, Missouri. They were following a tip from a former farmhand who had seen something he could not forget. What they found buried in shallow graves around the property changed everything people thought they knew about the quiet older couple who lived there. The woman at the center of it all was Fay Copeland. She was 68 years old at the time, a grandmother who had spent most of her life scraping by with odd jobs. But behind the ordinary farmhouse door, Fay and her husband Ray had been running a cold-blooded scheme that ended in murder. Fay was born in 1921 in Harrison, Arkansas. She married Ray Copeland in 1940, and for the next 40 years, the two of them moved around a lot because Ray kept getting caught for small-time theft and forgery. They had children, but they were always struggling financially. In 1967, they finally bought that farm in Mooresville, hoping it would give them some stability. Fay took whatever work she could find: factory shifts, cleaning motel rooms, even looking after other people's kids. By the mid-1980s, they were still struggling. That is when they came up with a plan to make fast cash. Ray would drive to homeless missions, pick up men who were down on their luck, and offer them a job on the farm. He promised them wages and a place to stay. Once the men were there, Ray had them open checking accounts in their own names. Then he sent them to livestock auctions to buy cattle using checks that he knew would bounce. After the cattle were bought, Ray quickly sold them again for cash, and that is where Fay came in. She kept careful handwritten notes on every worker: names, dates, how much they had been paid. When a name got crossed off the list, it meant the man was never coming back. Between the fall of 1986 and the spring of 1989, 5 men disappeared after working for the Copelands. Their names were Dennis Murphy, Wayne Warner, Jimmy Dale Harvey, John Freeman, and Paul Cowart. Each one was shot in the back of the head with the same .22 caliber rifle. Their bodies were buried on the farm or in a nearby barn. The motive was simple. Ray and Fay did not want any of these men alive to tell the police who had written the bad checks. Fay was not just along for the ride. She tracked every detail in her own handwriting. She even took pieces of the victims' clothing and stitched them into a quilt that ended up on a bed in their house. When police finally searched the farm in October of 1989, they found the 5 bodies, the rifle, the clothing, and Fay's lists, with names neatly crossed out. Both Fay and Ray were arrested that same day. Ray tried to pin everything on his wife. Fay told the jury she was a battered woman who had been afraid of her husband for decades and had no real idea what he was doing. But the evidence, especially those lists in her handwriting, told a different story. In November of 1990, a jury in Livingston County convicted Fay on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to death on 4 of the counts and life without parole on the 5th. At the time, she became one of the oldest women ever sent to death row in the United States. Ray received the same sentence and died in prison 3 years later. Fay spent the next several years fighting her sentence. In 1999, a federal judge looked at the case again and decided the original jury had not been allowed to fully consider evidence of the long-term abuse she suffered. He overturned the death sentences and changed them to life without parole. Fay stayed in prison until 2002, when she suffered a serious stroke that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. Because of her medical condition, she was granted a compassionate release to a nursing home in Chillicothe, Missouri. She lived there quietly until December 23, 2003, when she died at the age of 82. Number 7. Genene Jones. In the waiting room of a small pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas, a young mother sat with her 15-month-old daughter, Chelsea McClellan. It was September 17, 1982. Chelsea had come in for a routine checkup. Moments later, the little girl stopped breathing. The nurse on duty rushed in, took charge of the emergency, and fought hard to save her. That nurse was Genene Jones. She seemed calm and in control while everyone else panicked. But Chelsea never made it. What no one in that room knew was that Genene Jones had caused the crisis herself. Genene was 32 years old at the time, a licensed vocational nurse who had spent the previous 4 years working in the pediatric intensive care unit at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio. She was not some gentle grandmother figure. She was a strong, confident woman in her early 30s who knew how to step up when things went wrong. Parents and doctors trusted her. She had a way of being right there when a child suddenly took a turn for the worse. It started back in the late 1970s when Genene began her job in the San Antonio Hospital's intensive care unit. Around 1981, something strange started happening on her 3 to 11 evening shift. Babies who had been stable would suddenly seize, bleed, or stop breathing. The medical team would rush in, and Genene was always the first one to spot the problem and the most active person trying to bring the child back. She thrived on those moments. She would cry and hold the babies and tell everyone how hard she was fighting for them. Some of the children who died on her watch included infants like Joshua Sawyer in December of 1981, and others whose names are still remembered by their families. One baby boy named Rolando Santos, only 4 weeks old, survived repeated overdoses of a blood-thinning drug called heparin while under Genene's care. He pulled through, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. By early 1982, the hospital staff had grown suspicious. Too many emergencies were happening on Genene's shift, and too many of them pointed back to her. Instead of firing her outright, the hospital quietly let her go with a positive recommendation. Genene packed up and took a new job at the pediatric clinic in Kerrville, about an hour away. That is where Chelsea McClellan came in. Genene injected the toddler with a powerful muscle-relaxant drug called succinylcholine. It paralyzed her breathing. Chelsea died in the clinic that day. Genene was right there, leading the code, playing the role of the hero one more time. The clinic doctor, Kathleen Holland, had already started noticing problems with Genene. When Chelsea died, the pieces finally came together. Police arrested Genene in May of 1983. At trial in 1984, she was convicted of murdering Chelsea McClellan and sentenced to 99 years in prison. She was also convicted of injuring Rolando Santos back in San Antonio and received another 60 years to run at the same time. For years, that seemed like the end of the story. But investigators kept digging into the unexplained deaths from her time at Bexar County Hospital. In 2017, a grand jury in San Antonio charged her with 5 more murders. In January of 2020, Genene took a plea deal. She admitted to killing Joshua Sawyer by injecting him with a deadly substance. The other charges were dropped in exchange for her guilty plea. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 20 years. Even after all that time behind bars, Genene had moments during parole hearings where she looked straight at the board and said she really did kill those children. She never showed real remorse for the attention she had craved. She is still serving that life sentence today at the Lane Murray Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Number 8. Velma Barfield. In a hospital room in Lumberton, North Carolina, on February 3, 1978, a 56-year-old tobacco farmer named Roland Stewart Taylor lay dying. His girlfriend, Velma Barfield, sat right beside the bed, holding his hand and looking every bit the worried, caring woman everyone knew. Doctors thought it was a stomach bug, or maybe heart trouble. They had no idea Velma had been slipping arsenic rat poison into his tea and beer for days. That quiet bedside scene was the end of a long, hidden trail of poisonings that stretched back nearly 10 years. And Velma Barfield, a grandmother who baked pies and looked after sick people for a living, turned out to be the one who had caused every single one of them. Velma was born in 1932 in a small rural community near Eastover, North Carolina. She married young, had 2 children, and spent most of her life in and around Parkton trying to keep a roof over their heads. They never really had enough money. She worked as a housekeeper and later as a live-in caregiver for elderly folks who needed help with daily things. On the surface, she seemed reliable and kind. Neighbors liked her. But behind that dependable front, she had developed a serious addiction to prescription painkillers and tranquilizers after a back injury and a hysterectomy. To feed that habit, she started forging checks and taking out loans in other people's names. When the people she stole from started to notice, Velma found a way to keep them shut. She used ordinary arsenic-based rat poison. She would mix tiny amounts into their coffee, soup, tea, or cereal. The victims got violently sick with vomiting, diarrhea, and stomach pain. They would end up in the hospital, and Velma would be right there at the bedside, playing the role of the devoted nurse who never left their side. She told people she only meant to make them ill long enough to repay the money she had taken. Her first confessed victim was her own mother, Lillian Bullard. In December of 1974, Lillian started having the same terrible symptoms after Velma gave her something to eat. She died soon afterward. Velma later admitted she had poisoned her to cover a forged loan in her mother's name. Next came an elderly couple she was hired to look after in 1976. Montgomery Edwards died in January of 1977, and his wife, Dolly Edwards, passed away 2 months later in March. Velma confessed to poisoning Dolly after she discovered some of the forgeries. Then there was John Henry Lee, a 76-year-old man she cared for in the spring of 1977. When he found out about a forged check, Velma slipped the poison into his food. He died on June 4th of that year. Her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor, was the last one. He was a relative of Dolly Edwards, and Velma had moved in with him after the Edwardses were gone. When he began to suspect the missing money, she poisoned him too. This time, the family pushed for an autopsy. The test came back positive for arsenic. Police arrested Velma in May of 1978. She admitted to the 4 poisonings she had carried out herself and gave police a detailed account of how she had done it. She insisted over and over that she never wanted anyone to die, only to get sick so she could nurse them and buy herself time to fix the financial mess. The jury did not believe her. In December of 1978, they convicted her of first-degree murder for Stuart Taylor's death. The judge sentenced her to death. Velma spent the next 6 years on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh. She became a born-again Christian, started ministering to other inmates, and even received visits and support from Billy and Ruth Graham. But the courts turned down every appeal. On November 2nd, 1984, at the age of 52, Velma Barfield became the first woman executed by lethal injection in the United States in more than 20 years. She was also the first woman put to death in the country since the Supreme Court allowed executions to resume in 1976. Number 9. Elfriede Blauensteiner. In a small Vienna apartment in January of 1996, police officers stood at the door of a 64-year-old woman named Elfriede Blauensteiner. They had come about the sudden death of a 77-year-old retired pensioner she had been looking after. The man, Alois Pickler, had answered one of her personal ads, moved in with her, and then fallen gravely ill after just 5 weeks. Doctors first thought it was natural old age trouble, but something about the paperwork and the timing did not sit right with his family. When the officers questioned Elfriede, she tried to explain it away. They arrested her anyway. That knock on the door ended a secret that had stretched back more than a decade. Elfriede Blauensteiner, who would later become known across Austria as the Black Widow, had spent years meeting lonely older men through newspaper ads or while working as a neighbor and caregiver. She would marry them or move in, get them to rewrite their wills in her favor, and then slowly poison them so the deaths looked completely natural. The money and property she inherited went straight to the casinos where she gambled almost every day of the year. Elfriede was born in Vienna in 1931 and lived there her whole life. By the time she reached her 50s, she had developed a serious gambling habit that pulled her into the casinos 200 or 300 times a year. She needed cash to keep playing, and she found an efficient way to get it. She placed personal ads looking for companionship, or she offered to help elderly neighbors with daily chores. The men she chose were usually in their 60s or 70s, often widowed and living alone. They saw her as a kind, reliable older woman who wanted to take care of them. Once they trusted her, she would talk them into changing their wills or signing over their houses. Then, the slow poisoning would begin. She used a diabetes medication called euglucon, sometimes mixed with an antidepressant. She slipped small doses into their food or drinks over days or weeks. The drugs caused their blood sugar to crash, leading to confusion, coma, and eventually heart failure. To doctors and neighbors, it looked like ordinary old age illness. No one suspected foul play at first. She did this with at least 3 people the courts could prove. In the early 1990s, she cared for an 84-year-old neighbor named Franziska Koberl. After Franziska died, Elfriede had already arranged to get hold of her savings book worth around 170,000 euros. Then came Friedrich Doker, a 64-year-old retired man she met and married in 1994. He signed his house over to her and died the following year. Finally, there was Alois Pickler in late 1995. He lasted only 5 weeks under her roof before he too was gone. Each time, Elfriede collected the inheritance and went straight back to the gambling tables. She kept the pattern going for years because the deaths never raised immediate red flags. It was only when Alois Pickler's family noticed the suspicious will and the quick turnaround that police started digging deeper. They ordered exhumations. Toxicology tests found the diabetes drug in the bodies. When officers confronted Elfriede, she first admitted to 5 killings, then changed her story and insisted the men had simply died of natural causes. The first trial opened in Krems in February of 1997. The court convicted her of murdering Alois Pickler and gave her a life sentence. Her former lawyer got 7 years for helping forge the will. 2 years later, in 2001, a second trial in Vienna added convictions for the murders of Friedrich Doker and Franziska Koberl. She received another life sentence that ran alongside the first one. Elfriede spent the rest of her life in prison. She never showed any real regret. She told people the men had deserved what happened to them and even wrote memoirs claiming she had only wanted to help her husbands. In November of 2003, at the age of 72, she died in a Vienna hospital from a brain tumor while still serving those life sentences. Number 10. Judy Buenoano. In a parking lot in Pensacola, Florida, on June 25, 1983, John Gentry slid behind the wheel of his car and turned the key. The moment the interior light came on, the whole thing exploded. John survived the blast, but he was badly hurt. What he did not know yet was that the woman he planned to marry had planted the dynamite and wired it to that light. That same woman had also been feeding him arsenic hidden in vitamin capsules for weeks before the bomb. Her name was Judy Buenoano. Most people who knew her in the quiet town of Gulf Breeze, Florida, saw a hard-working single mom who ran a small beauty salon and took care of her family. She had come a long way from a tough childhood in Texas, where she was born in 1943. She worked for a time as a nursing assistant before opening her salon. On the surface, she seemed like someone you could trust, but behind that ordinary life, Judy had spent more than a decade making sure the people closest to her died so she could collect the insurance money. It started in 1971. Her husband, Air Force Sergeant James Goodyear, had just come home from Vietnam. 3 months later, he was dead at the age of 37. Doctors first thought it was some kind of heart and kidney failure. Nobody suspected poison at the time. Judy collected more than $200,000 in life insurance and veterans benefits. 7 years later, in 1978, her common-law husband, Bobby Joe Morris, died in Colorado. His family always had doubts, but the case stayed quiet until later. Then came the hardest one for people to understand. In May of 1980, Judy took her own 19-year-old son, Michael Goodyear, out canoeing on the East River near Milton, Florida. Michael had been partially paralyzed for years after suffering mysterious illnesses that doctors now believe were caused by arsenic she had given him earlier. At some point, the canoe overturned. Michael went under and drowned. Judy made it to shore and called for help. After his death, she collected another life insurance payout. By 1983, she was engaged to John Gentry. She had already taken out a $510,000 life insurance policy on him. When the arsenic capsules failed to kill him, she moved on to the car bomb. John survived and started talking to the police. Investigators dug into the old deaths, ordered exhumations, and found high levels of arsenic in James Goodyear's body. They found bomb-making materials in Judy's house that matched the one in John's car. Witnesses remembered her talking openly about using arsenic to kill people. The trials came one after another. In 1984, a jury in Santa Rosa County convicted her of murdering her son Michael. She received life in prison with no parole for 25 years. Later that same year, she was convicted in Escambia County of trying to murder John Gentry and got 12 more years. Then, in 1985, an Orange County jury convicted her of first-degree murder for poisoning her husband James. The judge sentenced her to death. Judy always insisted she was innocent. She said the deaths were just tragic coincidences and that she had nothing to do with any poison or any bomb. The evidence told a different story. Over the next 13 years, her appeals ran out. On the morning of March 30th, 1998, at the age of 54, Judy Buenoano became the first woman executed in the state of Florida in 150 years. She was also the first woman put to death by electric chair in the United States since 1976. These women looked like the perfect grannies, kind, harmless, and trustworthy. Yet they committed some of the coldest murders imaginable while hiding in plain sight. Thanks for watching the whole series. If you want more deep dive true crime series like this, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next one.